I think it's quite hard to define because, like any philosophical question, there's a lot of dispute about what exactly it amounts to. But I think one of the things which you might say about ethics is that it's normative rather than descriptive. So it's something which is talking about what you should do rather than describing what people do. So ethics is looking at the way, I think, primarily how we should behave towards others. There is a little bit about how you should behave towards yourself, but it's primarily about how you should behave towards others, what you should do for them, what you should not do to them. And also partly about how you should live your life and what it would be to live a good life. Philosophers, when they talk about ethics, tend to divide it up into three distinct areas. So one area is called metaethics, and metaethics is partly about what ethics is, whether ethics is objective or whether it's subjective, and it's partly a matter of our talk about ethics as well. So metaethics is about whether ethics is something which is objective or not. Then you've got something which is known as normative ethics, and normative ethics is about different types of ethical systems, which I'll talk about in a little while. And then thirdly, you've got applied ethics, and applied ethics is how ethics applies to everyday situations such as abortion, the ethics of abortion, euthanasia, war, terrorism. So those are the topics which ethics involves. Ethics applies to artificial intelligence in a whole range of different ways. One way which it applies to artificial intelligence is in terms just of the politics, so that's an ethical question about how we should structure our society. Another way in which it applies to ethics is the way in which we should use AI. So then the ethical questions are about people who are using the AI or developing the AI. And then thirdly, there's questions about autonomous AI as well, about what type of ethical rules an AI system should follow, and how you would be able to instill those ethical rules into an AI system. So I think there's a number of different ways in which it applies. Yeah, so I think in terms of the short-term implications are partly about the use of AI. So I think they're the socio-economic implications. So they particularly, I think, come up with jobs. Because they come up with jobs and what kinds of jobs we'll be having in the future, then also there'll be questions to do with education. What should we be teaching young people for the future? If the jobs which we have now are going to go, then what kind of skills should we be instilling into young people? There's also questions about social spaces. With our high streets disappearing, then how should we be using social spaces? High streets are disappearing, people are spending more time online, then how should we have our social spaces? And of course there's the use of AI in terms of health and the ethical issues which come up with that. So I think in the short term, the ethical questions with AI tend to be socio-economic questions. In the medium term, particularly with the development of AI, where AI is able to do more things autonomously, where autonomously in a weak sense, in the sense that maybe it will be told what it has to do, it has a particular goal, so it doesn't make up the goal for itself, so it's not fully autonomous, but it's weakly autonomous in the sense it's given a goal and then it can be autonomous in the way which it tries to fulfill that goal. In that weak sense of autonomy, you've got the medium-term question, I think, of a code of ethics for AI. And particularly that is in terms of the direct use of AI. I think that comes up particularly with things such as warfare. So with the development of drones, for one thing, there's going to be questions. It's going to have all kinds of implications, I think, for just war theory, where at present most people think in terms of just war theory. I think any kind of recent debate on war has tended to go back to questions of just war theory, such as right intention and having a just cause and it being proportional. I think questions to do with drones might well change the just war tradition, partly because you're now going to have wars which can be carried out without any threat at all against the well-being of a particular country. For example, in the near future, it's quite possible that America could launch a war and not put a single person in harm's way because the people who are operating the drones might be safely in Washington. So in the medium term, you're going to have all of these ethical questions which come up, I think, with the use of AI, such as in warfare. And you've also got questions to do with privacy, with the kind of information which is available. So it might well be that there's a whole load of information which is out there. The ethical questions, I think, come in much more strongly with the question of amalgamating all of that information. So it's one thing to have a range of different information about someone out there in the world. It's another thing for that information to be put together. And if you've got something such as AI, then that AI might be able to put that information together. So in the medium term, those I think are the questions. It's about the direct use of AI and how that can affect our lives. And then in the very long term, I think there are other questions which come up with AI, in particular about the existential risks which it brings to us in general. So if you've got AI which reaches a point of singularity so that its intelligence goes far beyond our kind of intelligence, then you've got a question about how that AI should behave and what kind of ethical motivations it should have and how it can be prevented from harming people. I think there's two sides to this. On the one side, there is the existential risk, and I think that's probably a risk assessment. You think about the probability of that kind of thing happening against the kind of risks which might come up, and then you make a judgment on that basis. But I think there's also another side of it, which is that AI could solve the very real existential risk which seems to be coming up with climate change. And there are various philosophers who think, well, with climate change, this actually causes a problem for our morality, because our morality was something which was developed in an evolutionary context. And an evolutionary context would be one in which morality was a matter of short-term interactions between people, where you would have a clearly defined agent and you would have a clearly defined victim, and that the actions would be something which would be occurring within a short space of time. With climate change, it seems you don't have one particular agent, you don't have one particular victim, and it occurs over centuries rather than in a particular instance. And so there's some philosophers who think we can never quite get a grip on the ethics of climate change. That is, we all know that what we're doing is it's just awful. We're destroying not just ourselves, but we're destroying the planet. And we can't quite get a grip on that ethically because we haven't quite got the ethical system inside of us, because we think ethically just in terms of a small scale. So one way which you could think of AI as being able to tackle those ethical questions in a way which we can't, because it would have a different way of looking at those ethical questions. So when it comes to the long term, I think in summary, when it comes to the long term, there are existential risks, but there are also potentially existential benefits as well to AI. Yeah, so when it comes to normative ethics, there are three major ethical theories. There are, of course, a range of other ones, but I think the three major ethical theories are deontological ethics, which is often associated most commonly with Kant, consequentialism, a version of which utilitarianism is most often associated with John Stuart Mill, and virtue ethics, which is most commonly associated with Aristotle. When it comes to deontological ethics and consequentialism, they tend to be, at least if you're thinking in terms of AI, then they can be easily translated, I think, into some kind of top-down rules by which AI could work. Whereas when you're thinking about virtue ethics, I think that is more in line with a bottom-up approach, particularly in terms of reinforcement learning or evolutionary learning. So I'll just say something quickly about those three ethical approaches. Deontological ethics it comes from the Greek meaning duty-based, and the idea is that there are some things which it is your duty to do. You have a duty to follow morality, and that morality is a set of certain rules or laws which you should follow. For example, with the Ten Commandments, or in AI with something such as Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. So, for example, Kant, for example, infamously claimed that you shouldn't lie, and that this was irrespective of any consequences. So you should never lie. It's just a rule. Your duty is to follow that. And he gives the example of an axe murderer coming to your door and asking whether your friend is home because they want to kill your friend. And Kant, to the shock of many, says, well, actually, you should tell the axe murderer where your friend is. If the axe murderer says, is your friend upstairs, then you should say, if your friend is upstairs, you should say yes. Because, he says, you have a duty to follow morality, and morality says you should never lie. So deontological ethics is a matter of having a certain set of laws or duty which you have to follow. And you can see how that might apply to something such as AI, because you can see how something such as Asimov's 3 laws of robotics are certain set rules which are structured in a particular way in Asimov's book. There are certain set rules which robots would have to follow, in particular the rule of do not cause harm to a human being. So that's deontological ethics. There's another approach to ethics, which is consequentialism, or a more specific version is utilitarianism. So whereas deontological ethics is concerned with doing the right actions and having the right intentions, consequentialism is not so interested in what you're doing at a particular point, but is interested in what happens afterwards. So, according to consequentialism, what's important is the ends and not the means by which you do them. Utilitarianism specifies those ends, which an ethical system should be aiming for, as the end of maximising happiness or perhaps well-being and minimising pain or unhappiness. So the utilitarian would tend to think that you can make a calculation about what action you should do depending on what the consequences of that action will be. If your action is going to be one which is going to cause happiness to thousands of people, then it's the right action to do. If your action is going to be one which is going to cause a little bit of misery for someone, then that's a action which you shouldn't do. And you make that calculation, and you can kind of see how that might be something which potentially, at least, I think there's a lot of formal problems, but potentially at least you can see how that's something which AI might be able to calculate in a way which we couldn't calculate. Those are the 2 rule-based approaches, top-down approaches. There's a third approach which I think fits in perhaps slightly better with the way in which AI is developed, where I think AI has perhaps developed less in a rule-based way and more in a learning type environment. So when it comes to learning and things such as neural nets, you've got virtue ethics, which I think tends to make more sense of that. So according to virtue ethics, you should behave in the way in which a virtuous person would behave. So there aren't any set rules which you should follow. There are no set consequences which you should be aiming for. Rather, you should aim to develop the right kind of character, a character which would act in the appropriate way in a range of different scenarios without those things being programmed in as such. So the idea is that you should follow some kind of exemplar of what a virtuous person would be, and to act virtuously is to act well and to act ethically is to act as that exemplar would act in a particular situation. I mean, one thing to say I think about a code of ethics for AI is ethics is quite soft, so it isn't something which compels anyone. So the whole idea of ethics is that you're ethical if you make a choice and you make the ethical choice. But the fact is there's a choice there. That is what it is to be ethical. So ethical rules are soft. They are things which you can follow, but they're things which you don't have to follow, physically don't have to follow. So they're not hard like, for example, the laws of nature. The laws of nature are hard. You have to follow them. You've got no choice. You can't defeat the laws of gravity. Now, the problem, I think, with a code of ethics for AI is, given that ethical laws are soft anyway, ethical rules are soft anyway, then in order to enforce them, I think there has to be quite significant sanctions. So what's happening at the moment, as far as I can tell, is that various companies, for example, Google, are drawing up their own ethical codes of conduct. But that doesn't look as if it's going to be hard enough, because there isn't, unless you've got a system in law or potentially some other form of sanction in place, such that if someone doesn't follow this code of ethics, then there's going to be a punishment, then I think they're not going to be worth very much at all. So it looks as if you need some kind of laws in place, and one of the problems I think about having laws in place is that they tend to come up through trial and error. If you think about things such as codes of practice within medical ethics, I think a lot of them will tend to come up after the event, that people change the code of practice because something has happened which has been negative. So it is going to be quite difficult, I think, to have a code of ethics. I mean, obviously people need to draw one up, but it's going to be quite difficult to get one which is quite effective beforehand. Normally with a code of ethics, you're actually developing one as you go along in response to things which have happened, which are negative. And that, I suppose that could be a significant worry with AI and can set it back quite considerably. If you think about something such as automated cars, if there's one accident with automated cars, you can see how that's going to set things back quite significantly. In terms of the IEE's code of principles, I mean, there's a whole range of philosophical questions which come up. So, for example, that systems should respect human rights. Human rights itself is a contested area, particularly within philosophy. It has its basis within religion, within an area called natural rights. And even if you look at the most basic human rights, such as the right to life or the right to freedom of speech, we can see that actually they tend not to be inalienable. They're often said to be inalienable, but of course they're not. If you look at somewhere like America, the right to life is certainly not inalienable because people are executed and killed. So, I mean, there are difficulties with trying to spell out exactly. I mean, we kind of think of human rights as being something which is settled and quite obvious, but it isn't obvious, and it's often argued for. Exactly what should be understood as human rights. Secondly, that a system should enhance well-being, I think is again quite difficult to spell out, because if you're asking, well, what is well-being? Are we talking here about maximising pleasure? Well, if we're talking about maximising pleasure, then Brave New World had a solution to that, and it's probably not a solution which we would want, in which people were drugged up to feel happy. So I guess it's a kind of fuller sense of well-being. But then if it's a fuller sense of well-being, it's quite difficult to know exactly what we're talking about. There's a Greek term, eudaimonia, which is a term which Aristotle had. It effectively means something like happiness, but happiness in a wider sense, in the sense of a flourishing life. So that might be something where we might want AI to think about how that can lead to a flourishing life. And the third point, which I think is worth bringing up, is transparency. I think a lot of AI code of ethics are talking about transparency, but as with anything, there's always a balance to be made here between some kind of freedom and some kind of security. So on the one hand, we want transparency. We certainly want to know how AI and how the programs work, particularly if we're bringing it into law enforcement. But on the other hand, if you've got too much transparency, that can weaken security. Because if there's transparency about how a program works, then that program can be put to negative ends. It can be used by someone else to be put to negative ends. So there has to be, I think, a balance between transparency and security. And it's going to depend really on who you're most fearful of. You want transparency if you're fearful of the people who are in charge. You want security if you're more fearful of other citizens doing something. And it really, but you do need a balance between the two. I think in terms of accountability, there certainly needs to be some kind of accountability, but there's going to be problems, I think, as there is with something like climate change, with tracing what the accountability is when you're developing a system, who's accountable for it. It's going to depend, I guess, on how autonomous the system is, for one thing. If the system's autonomous, then perhaps you want to trace the accountability back to the programmers. If the system is something which is a tool, then you might well want to trace the accountability to the person who's using that tool. So I think there's philosophical questions which come up with all of those key parts of the IEE's guidance. So when it comes to robotics, I think there's another question which starts to come into play. We're tending to think about AI from the point of view of moral agents, where the moral agents are either the people who develop the AI or the people who program the AI, or potentially, if it's autonomous, the AI itself. But there's two sides to ethics. There's the moral agency, and then there's the moral patiency. And when it comes to robots, you might, and particularly with interacting robots, you might come to a point where you think, well, actually, there's certain rights which are now due to AI itself. And that would open up a whole range of questions. Whether, for example, at the point where AI becomes something which we think has moral patiency, that is, it's something which is worthy of moral status itself, we have a question about whether AI is something which has equal moral status with human beings. If it's something which has equal moral status with human beings, then we tend to think with human beings that human beings should act well with other people, but that they also should, maybe not should, but it's permitted to put yourself first. So we often think, well, if it's a matter of me or him, that it's me. And so if we think, well, that's part and parcel of ethics, this acceptability of putting yourself, if it's down to a kind of bare fight between you and someone else, then you have the right, you have the permissibility to put yourself first. Well, if we're thinking of AI as becoming a moral patient, then it seems as if we follow that through, that the AI can put itself first above human beings. And that would cause a whole range of problems. So I do think that those kind of questions come up when we're thinking about AI in terms of robots, because then we are thinking in terms of, I think, more along the lines of autonomy than we would if you're thinking about AI not in a robotic form. then there's less autonomy. It looks as if it's something which is going to be more used as a tool, whereas when it becomes something which is more along the lines of robotics, it looks as if there's more potential for autonomy, and so as a result there's more potential for the AI to have moral status, and then as a result there's more potential for the AI to put itself above human beings in certain senses. I'm Dr. Michael Wilby. I'm a lecturer at Anglia Ruskin University, and I lecture in philosophy, and my particular interests are in philosophy of mind, but I also do a bit of teaching in ethics, so the philosophy of AI kind of combines those two areas.